First of all, I want to say how overwhelmed I am and humbled I am to be inducted into the Texas Institute of Letters. It came as a big surprise to me. I never expected it. Still not sure I deserve it. I've always sort of looked at myself as a wandering minstrel songwriter who just turns out these ditties and little songs. I try to make them as poetic as I can, but I try to make them appeal to everybody, the average guy. In pop music, if you get too high flown, you tend to lose your audience. And as the poet Marshall once said, nobody reads if nobody writes, and nobody writes if nobody reads. So I want to make sure I've got some listeners out there in terms of the way I write things. But I really don't think about all that when I'm putting together a song. Anyway, this is my best known song. I'm going to play it first, and then as you have requested, I'm going to talk a little bit about how I put it together, what the experiences were that led up to writing this song, and a little bit about how I, as you put it, crafted it. But I don't really think of myself as a craftsman so much as somebody who cobbles things together more. It's just called Wildfire. She comes down from Yellow Mountain on a dark flat land she rides. On a pony she named Wildfire. A whirlwind by your side on a cold Nebraska night. They say she died one winter when there came a killing frost, and the pony she named Wildfire busted down and stalled. In a blizzard he was lost. Ran calling wildfire. She ran calling wildfire. Calling wildfire. So by the dark of the moon I planted, but there came an early snow. Bit of hoot owl howling outside my window now. 6 nights in a row she's coming for me. And on Wildfire we're both gonna go. We'll be riding wildfire, riding wildfire. We'll be riding wildfire. Gonna leave side busting behind. Get the hard times right on out of our minds. We'll be riding wildfire. Well, to talk about that song a little bit, first of all, it's a ghost story. And I dreamed this song. I didn't write it. I actually did a lot of things that led up to my dream, though. But then I internalized it all. And I woke up from a dream in the middle of the night, and I have usually a pad of paper or something not far from me when I get up at night, and I write down my dreams. And I like the way things come out in dreams, because sometimes they're really mysterious images and deserve some interpretation, or sometimes they don't deserve any interpretation. You can't make anything out of what it means, but you can describe it. And I've always said I don't really know what wildfire means. I mean, I've interpreted my dream many different ways, but over the years I've come to realize that there's some things that led up to my having that dream. First of all, my grandfather was from Kentucky, and he was a storyteller. He was a mountain man. He came to Texas, a fairly young man, to be a cattle rancher and a cowboy because he didn't want to work in the coal mines there. And when I was about 3 or 4 years old, I used to walk down to his house. He lived just a few doors down from us in Dallas. And he was a mountain man and a farmer. Later on, it wasn't long before he got out of there and got out of the city and went back to the country. And I remember going out to visit him in the summers. And after work was over on the ranch and the farm work was done, he was always sitting on the front porch with a mason jar rattling some ice around in some iced tea, and he'd start to look out over the horizon, and the kids would come gather around, and we knew he was about to tell us a story. And a lot of the stories that come from the backwoods that old men and old women tell kids are ghost stories. And somehow or other, I got this ghost story in my head and lived with it since the time I was a child. I don't really specifically know if he told me this ghost story. I just know that he told me a lot of ghost stories, but I've often wondered if this was one of them. In thinking about writing this song, or writing some songs, what I always do is I just collect images. I like to just have a notebook around, and I just like to collect images, and I read all kinds of things, books, poems, and things, and I collect images. And one of the things I love to do is collect images from classical poetry, really medieval and ancient poetry, back when being a poet was something that was, I don't know how to say it better, but something that was really a craft and really respected. And the wandering minstrel was the basis of it all. We all know that Homer wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey to be a song cycle. It was songs. It all started off as singer-songwriting, and poetry really didn't break off from song till, hundreds and hundreds of years later. It's even thought that Jesus may have sung the Sermon on the Mount, because if you break it down from the Aramaic that he probably spoke, translate it back from the way we read it now, it sets up in meter and rhyme a bit. And the imagery could have been put together in that way that he would have sung it. He would have, if he was going to do anything poetic, he would have sung it. That's just the way that it happened in ancient times. So I look for images that I can internalize, and I keep them in notebooks, and I read them over sometimes. I don't necessarily try to write a song around it. I just write down an image, that I have in my mind, or something that I read. A horse coming across a dark landscape, a mysterious horse. Part of that probably comes from my religious upbringing in the book of Revelation, the kind of strange imagery that you see in that book. And in that book, it says that Jesus is coming back on a white horse. And a white horse has always been a symbol for salvation and for a hero to come riding in on a white horse. And as I say this right now, we're getting close to Easter time. I love the story in Luke where Jesus says, "Go and get me a horse. I'm going to be riding into Jerusalem. I need to come in there. Go get me a horse." And it says in there that he actually rides a horse, and the context of it is now that he came in on a donkey. And the word in Greek is vague enough that we don't know for sure, but it could have been a horse. But it's even more cool to think about the fact that if he rode in on a donkey, that later on the prophecy was he was going to come on a white horse. Of course, kings and barons and royal ladies and people like that, they often were known to ride white horses, particularly an Andalusian horse in Spain. One that was a milky gray color was considered to be the horse of royalty. So that led to some stories in the Southwest that developed, since we're talking about Texas and the plains. And if you go to J. Frank Dobie's book, The Mustangs, he goes through a number of stories and legends about horses, ghost stories that were told in the Southwest about horses. And my favorite one is the pacing white Mustang of the Llano Estacado. That is where a pacing horse can never be captured by the Mustangers. They try and try, but they can never run this wild horse down. He's got this free spirit. He's got this ability to elude them with his pacing kind of movement. He doesn't necessarily run. He paces really fast. And he runs a little bit once somebody gets up close and tries to get a rope on him. But then he starts to run. And then when he tires out, the people who are chasing him, because they're already tired from that pacing, then he runs again. And the story goes that in the end, if he's cornered on the edge of a canyon, he jumps off of a cliff into the darkness and chooses what Patrick Henry talked about, liberty or death. And he chooses to be free in death rather than to be captured by the Mustanger's rope. And this story has been traded around the Southwest for years, and I was exposed to it over and over again. Then I found it later. So it took me a long time to interpret what Wildfire is really about. It's about a horse coming, the girl dying, becoming a ghost, and coming back to save somebody from hard times. The thing that we always dream about is having a savior, having somebody to come and save us. I'm not talking about necessarily Christian imagery here. I'm just talking about the human dream is that something's going to come and get us out of this mess, And so this great story in the Southwest was put into a song because I had heard this imagery all my life. And in terms of how I put the song together out of the dream, I use the same technique I always use when I write a song. I think songwriters have a little easier time of it than poets because we have a melody that gives us a rhythm and a meter that we can get down first. I always start with the melody first. I play the melody, I play some chords, and I start to just close my eyes and think about what I see when I hear those chords. It's like if you do this, to every individual person who hears that, there's going to be a little bit different imagery that's going to come to mind. But as you get the imagery going, then the words start to come. What I like about songwriting and why I've really never gotten out of that category of being a songwriter, I love it because I think songwriting is probably the basis of literature. We know that the Neanderthals actually sang songs and chants and had instruments. Now that's been discovered by people who have found these sites where there obviously was some drumming and some chanting and stuff going on. So, but I have a meter. If I go, la da 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 da. And I could also put a different hum a different melody with that. I could go ba do 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 da dee da la da dee da dee la dee da la la me the sun da da dee da da da. Or I could go da 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 la da la dee da da dee da da. Take even one of those lines as a piece of poetry. They're each going to have slightly different meter or rhyme, or sometimes they're going to come out exactly perfect, just like an old-time rhyming poem does. What I do is I get that meter down. I studied scansion. I was an English major in college and a creative writing major at UCLA. I think I was one of the first people to actually craft a creative writing course at UCLA because they really didn't have that department then. But I said I wanted to actually practice writing. I just didn't want to read literature. I wanted to be able to practice writing it. More than just learning the grammar of the English language, I wanted to study the techniques of writing. They said, well, we're not really sure that we have anything like that. So they put me in a special class with a poet named Charles Gullins, who was a professor, but also a published poet at UCLA. So I was right away working with somebody who saw things even in free verse in a kind of meter. Anyway, I would get the scansion of my lines down. Now I've got a form like a poet works with a sonnet. In songwriting though, one line may set up a certain way and the next line is shorter and the next line's a little bit longer because of the way the melodies work. But nonetheless, I would get that down, and then I didn't have to have an instrument. I could be riding on a plane or riding along in a car or out to lunch, and I'd get out my notebook and look at the scansion of the line from the song, and I already knew the melody in my head, but even if I'd forgotten the melody, I'm working with this certain meter, and I would start to write it out like a poem and try to fit words into it. Beyond that, how do you get the images into words? Well, that is somewhat of a mystical process that I don't think any writer can fully explain. In my case, I saw the girl coming across an open field in Nebraska from a place I called Yellow Mountain. I realized later that, gosh, not long after I got out of college, I took a drive all the way across the country, went across the Midwest by way of South Dakota, and I went through the Badlands. And up there in the northern part of Nebraska, around Chadron, Nebraska, you're right on the edge of the Badlands. And so, and then beyond that, you have the Black Hills, and that's what the Indians called Yellow Mountain because that's where Custer discovered gold. So they figured the white people were there to get that yellow stuff out, and that was called Yellow Mountain. At the time, there was even a historical plaque there in the Black Hills that said the Indians called it Yellow Mountain. I don't even know if it's still there or not. Anyway, I pictured the Badlands. And so there's always been some sort of Native American imagery attached to this. Later on, I realized that there is a story also among the Lakotas of white buffalo calf woman. She is a female figure who is like a goddess that comes in association with a white buffalo, and sometimes is known to be riding a white horse. She is the one who gave the sacred pipe to the people as what they use in their equivalent of, what we have in the Eucharist in the church. Instead of drinking wine, they smoke this pipe, and they have these visions. It's not necessarily anything psychedelic kind of a drug that's in there. Later on, the Native American church did involve peyote as part of their sacrament, and the Native American church was a Christian church that used peyote as the sacrament. I'm rambling, but there is this tradition that this woman came riding on a white horse and brought this pipe to the people, and brought this vision and truth to the people and their ability to have visions. I'm an adopted Lakota Indian now, and I think part of the reason I was adopted is because the Native Americans liked this song. At some point in time, back in the old way of doing things in the Lakota Nation, a young person would be sent off into the Black Hills, and you would fast for several days and get into a little bit of an altered state from not eating, and you would have a vision. And whatever vision you brought back was the vision you were known for. And they would put you in a clan of other people that had a similar vision. You might have somebody that came back and said, I saw an elk, or I saw a wounded horse. Okay, you're going to be in the wounded horse clan. You're going to be in the elk clan. It was always associated with animals, but sometimes just a rock or an inanimate object or a tree, little tree, big tree. Whatever the vision was, this was taken very, very seriously by people. So it's interesting to me that the Lakotas are an entire culture that live by the dreams of every person. Whatever dream they come back with, they live on the visions of the people. And having visions is a very important part of life. So I think that's why Native Americans like this song. And that's my story, and I'm sticking to it on Wildfire. That's a lot of it. You just have disparate things that you go through in your life, having heard some ghost stories here and read the book of Revelation, and then you run across this Indian story later about the woman riding across. But it's really interesting. I didn't read that legend until after I wrote the song. It took me years and years and years of researching the imagery in the song to try to pick through maybe where I had gotten those ideas as a child. The first song I ever released as a single also was the title song of an album I made called Geronimo's Cadillac. I'm going to sing the song, and then I'm going to tell a little bit about how I got the idea to do this song and how I put it together with another writer I collaborated with named Charles John Quarto. Put Geronimo in jail down south, where he couldn't look to give toys in the mouth. Sergeant, Sergeant, don't you feel something wrong with your automobile? Governor, Governor, now isn't it strange? They did not have no cars on the Indian range. Warden, Warden, listen to me. Be brave and set Geronimo free. Whoa, boys, take me back back. I wanna ride in Geronimo's Cadillac. Whoa, boys, take me back. I wanna ride in Geronimo's Cadillac. Whoa, boys, won't you take me back? I wanna ride in Geronimo's Cadillac. Let me ride, take me back. I wanna ride in Geronimo's Cadillac. Let me ride. Let me ride. Let me ride. Woo. Let me ride. White man, don't you know? Indians had no place to go. Took old Geronimo by storm, ripped off the feathers from his uniform. Jesus, tell me and I believe it's true. Red is a color in the sunset too. Ripped off his land, won't give it back. Sent Geronimo a Cadillac. I say, whoa, boys, take me back. I wanna ride in Geronimo's Cadillac. Whoa, boys, take me back. I wanna ride in Geronimo's Cadillac. Let me ride, take me back. Let me ride in Geronimo's Cadillac. Let me ride, take me back. Wanna ride in Geronimo's Cadillac. Let me ride. 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 So what in the world am I talking about? Geronimo's Cadillac. Well, here's how I got the idea for that song. I hang out with painters a lot. I hang a lot with visual artists. Tend to make friends with those people. I'm fascinated by painters, by sculptors, by people who actually craft things with their hands and paint and put visions on canvas, but use all these colors and techniques of sculpting. It's fascinating to me, and I love to hang around that stuff, go to art openings and stuff. I get ideas for songs from the images that I see. I was hanging out with a guy named Bill Holloway when I was in Austin, Texas. Neither one of us had gone to University of Texas, but we were both living in Austin at the time, and we'd been friends and roommates for a brief time at what's now called University of North Texas. It was North Texas State University at the time. And we got back together again, saw each other in Austin. In fact, I got a phone call. He said, "Murphy, you're down here making music, and Roberta and I just moved down here. We're living in a little apartment, come on over. So I used to come over and play music for him. And he'd say, well, I'd say, what are you working on? And he'd show me different paintings. Then he showed me this remarkable pencil drawing that he'd done of an Indian sitting in a Cadillac with 3 other Indians. 3 of them were dressed in powwow type outfits, feathers, kind of fancy Native American costume of the Plains Indian variety. And one is wearing a tuxedo and a top hat. And I found out, I said, what in the world is that? My favorite kind of painters, by the way, are surrealistic painters. I love Salvador Dali and studied a lot of surrealist painters over my time. I like it when artists come up with these crazy images that are literally surreal. You can't figure out how these things go together. But in trying to make that happen, you know, you come up with some things once in a while. In this case, I saw this picture of this Native American sitting in this old Cadillac. It's probably like a 1911 Cadillac. And I said, what is this all about? And it was a book called Geronimo, His Own Story. It's actually the autobiography of Geronimo, in which he tells about his life. It was actually dictated to an interpreter when Geronimo was in prison at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, which is in Indian territory at the time while they had a fort there. He had been imprisoned and sent there instead of sent off to an island somewhere. They usually would put some of these chiefs often on a key, like your island in Florida, so they couldn't escape. But they couldn't quite do that, and they didn't want to make a martyr out of him, because a lot of people were being sent to these islands and they were dying there because they weren't used to the tropical climate. So they didn't want to make a martyr out of him because he knew that would fire up the people. So they kept him in a jail. And I've seen the jail. The jail is still there. The cell is still there that he spent many years in. And he paced like a tiger around the inside of this cell, stone floor, but it's now about that deep. And he only walked barefoot or in moccasins around the edge of that till he wore this deep path in there. They finally let him out, and they wanted to put out a publicity picture that made it look like he'd been assimilated into white society. What better to do that than to make him look like he was wearing the fine clothes of a white man of his day? So they got this Cadillac, at least in this book they said it was a Cadillac. Later on I found out it was not a Cadillac, it was a locomobile, which was an early version of the Cadillac. Like the kind of car that John D. Rockefeller would have driven in the day. I don't know where they found this, but it was the Miller Brothers Wild West show that he was working for at the time, once he'd been let out of prison on a kind of a work release thing. And he was able to get out for a while, work for their Wild West show, and then he would have to go back onto the Fort Sill grounds. So they took this publicity picture and they put it out everywhere to promote the 101 Wild West show, but also to say, look, Geronimo's now one of us. He's become a white man. It's really interesting to look at the photograph, because in the photograph, Geronimo is looking right at the camera. He's wearing a top hat, not his normal costume as a Native American or clothing. But there's something remarkable in his eyes. You can see the message, I survived. I survived. And that's what the song is about. It's about survival. Geronimo was a pretty wily, diplomatic character. At the end of his book, his autobiography, which he dictated, as I said, he could not read or write. He said, I've always loved the white people. They're a very kind and beautiful race. He had spent enough time in prison and around these soldiers and their families that he had come to consider them part of his family. But this picture took it one step further. It was almost like he was now like sort of a John D. Rockefeller-like character of a chief. In fact, he never wore clothes like that. He did die at Fort Sill, and he's buried there, and you can go there and see his grave marker. So I put this song together. It's kind of a protest song about how Native Americans were treated. And when I put out my first album, my record company did not want me to put that out as a single because they considered it to be controversial. At the time, Native Americans were fighting for their rights right alongside of the black community and Martin Luther King, except they weren't getting the attention and they weren't winning the game like Martin Luther King did. They weren't getting the attention of people because they were living out on a reservation, not able to organize marches and things like that. Anyway, later on, a few years later, the song got used at the occupation of Wounded Knee, which is when a group of Lakotas took over a building on the reservation and said, "We are declaring sovereignty over our own land here. We no longer want to be reservation Indians." And that act caused them to be surrounded by National Guard, helicopters, people with AR-15s, high-powered rifles, bombs, hand grenades, totally surrounding this building of Indians who maybe had a rifle or two, and that was it. They took a record player. At the time, we put everything on vinyl, 33 1/3 records. And apparently they turned the speakers around, aimed them out the window, and played Geronimo's Cadillac for these federal agents and people. I was told later by one of the federal agents who was there, he said, that cowed down a lot of us. We listened to the song, and we felt bad about what we were doing, but we were under orders. We had to be there. So the song got used that way, and it got me in so much hot water that it got me on an FBI list. And for all I know, I'm still on that list. The Freedom of Information Act, I checked many years ago, and I was on a list, a watch list, just because I had written that song and because it had been used at Wounded Knee. A couple of years later, I ended up on the reservation in South Dakota at a wedding. I was getting married by a medicine man, and he had agreed to do it because he liked Geronimo's Cadillac. Later on, I found out he was the medicine man that was in Wounded Knee. His name was Guy Dullknife. So my Native American name is now Michael Martin Murphey Dullknife. Sounds kind of funny, but Dullknife was actually the Cheyenne leader who led the Cheyennes and the Lakotas out of captivity from Fort Reno and walked all the way back to the reservation in South Dakota. Along the way, 400 people were killed by the U.S. cavalry. Only 7 of them made it back. One of them was Dullknife, and when he got there, he said, "I stand here on my own land. You can kill me now, but I will never go back." So Dullknife, Guy Dullknife, was actually the grandson of that man who led that rebellion. And I got adopted into the Lakotas because I had written this song and it had been used like that. As writers, you probably all know, your songs are like children. You may give them birth, but as they grow up, it draws you into all kinds of things you didn't expect. So Geronimo's Cadillac is a protest song. I could go on and on and on about how I think protest songs ought to be written, but I find the best way to write a protest song is to bring out the beauty and the power of a people that you're protesting about, not to just sit there and tear down the people that are doing egregious things to keep their rights from being forwarded. You talk about how great the culture is, and then people are going to say, we need to preserve that. So instead of talking about the poor black people who were treated bad as slaves, you talk about the fact that gosh, if it wasn't for Count Basie, and other people, we wouldn't have jazz music, which became the basis of all of our pop music. The blues is the basis of a lot of pop music. You want to talk about the way the Irish were treated, or do you want to talk about the fact that the Irish had great music and their melodies became the basis of a lot of American folk songs? So I think bringing out the beauty, bringing out the power is much better than bringing out anything else. So I'll just finish off with a little piece of this. My soul is my pony, I rode here today, through Badlands and Black Hills. I came a long way. Hear me now, old man, I ask you to say a prayer for the people in your Sundance way. Medicine Man, I ask you to sing for us a dance, a chant to put us in a trance. Medicine Man, lift up your voice tonight and pass the pipe of everlasting light. So to get people to be interested in preserving the rights of a medicine man to practice his own religion, you have to describe the beauty of it and put imagery with it that draw people into it. That's the best way to write a, quote, protest song, is really to write a tribute song to how great the culture is.